In 1919, London was just waking from the long nightmare of the First World War, when a dazzling show suddenly arrived in the city, offering an escape to exotic Arabia and inviting audiences to come to the land of history, mystery, and romance. Londoners, starved for heroes after 4 years of brutal trench warfare, crowded in to watch documentary footage and color glass slides of a dashing young Englishman who appeared to lead a heroic revolt that toppled an empire. From the moment the show premiered, the world came to know Thomas Edward Lawrence as Lawrence of Arabia, an action hero and an intellectual hero in one, which set him apart from any of the other famous warriors of the 20th century. Yet fame brought controversy as well. Lawrence certainly played some role, but he was not necessarily the spark plug of that revolt. He was important and in fact became even more important after the war, turning his own life into a mysterious puzzle that challenges us to decide what was real and what was not, what was fantasy and what was fact. Who was Tay Lawrence? What did he really do? And did the myth match the man? By 1916, war was raging across Europe as Britain and her allies France and Russia struggled to push back German and Austrian attacks, with millions of men on both sides fighting and dying from machine gun fire, poison gas, and disease. Yet Tay Lawrence was far from the battlefield, stuck in an office in Cairo, because Europe's war had become a world war. The Turkish Ottoman Empire, stretching across the Middle East from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, had joined the fight on Germany's side, defeating Britain repeatedly and nearly capturing the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to its colonies. At that time, Lawrence was only a low-level officer at Britain's Middle East headquarters, while officials far above him urgently searched for an Arab leader who could ignite a revolt against the Ottoman Empire. They found such a figure in Sharif Hussein, the traditional protector of Mecca and a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. The British offered a vague promise that if the Arabs under Sharif Hussein rebelled against their Ottoman masters, they would gain an independent Arab state under Britain's sponsorship at the end of the war. Britain selected the desert leader Sharif Hussein for both practical and romantic reasons, having long believed that the Arabs' pure and genuine strains were to be found among tribal peoples of the desert, while corrupt and false strains existed in the cities among politicians. In June 1916, Sharif Hussein and his sons launched the Arab Revolt under what they believed to be Britain's guarantee. They succeeded in driving the Ottoman army out of the holy city of Mecca, but minimal training and limited British support soon brought their advance to a standstill. Meanwhile, Lawrence, assigned to make maps, interview prisoners, and write intelligence reports, observed the Arab Revolt from afar, filled with dreams of glory and growing impatience. He possessed intense capacity, ambition, and power, yet also a deep ambiguity about it, once writing in exasperation, "I hate to lead, but I don't obey orders." In October 1916, he took a leave of absence from his desk job in Cairo and would never return to that desk again, setting out on an unofficial journey into the desert to see the ailing Arab Revolt for himself. His meeting with Sharif Hussein's son Faisal transformed his life. At first glance, he felt he had found the man he had come to Arabia to seek, the leader who would bring the Arab Revolt to full glory. Regal, ambitious, and receptive, Faisal recognized in Lawrence a useful ally, while Lawrence saw in Faisal's men a mobile fighting force with untapped potential. He believed the Arab movement was shallow not because the Arabs did not care, but because they were few, and in their small numbers lay a certain strength. Returning to Cairo, Lawrence argued that the Arab Revolt required guidance, funds, and weapons rather than British troops, a proposal his superiors welcomed given the heavy casualties on the Western Front. Like many Britons of his era, Lawrence sought to expand Britain's influence and believed tribal populations were the most effective partners, as the British assumed they were easier to influence. Although other British officers were already active in the field, Lawrence had impressed Faisal, and headquarters sent him into the desert as Faisal's official liaison. He embodied the role of an intelligence analyst, bringing academic rigor, skepticism, subject matter expertise, and language familiarity to his duties, which made him indispensable and convinced his superiors of his ability to operate independently in the desert. It seemed as though Turenne had been preparing for this moment all his life. Fascinated by chivalry and the Crusades since childhood, he traveled to the Ottoman-occupied Middle East during college to survey Crusader castles, and despite warnings that he might not survive, he went anyway, walking 0-0 alone through Syria and Palestine in 1909. During these solitary walking tours in Syria, he learned the land, how to live off it, and how to exist like a Bedouin or a villager, fitting in with them from the very beginning. He trained himself to endure foodless weeks, waterless nights, and sleepless hardship, constantly testing the limits of his endurance. Though he had gone to Syria to study the Crusades, encountering the Arabs whose ancestors had fought the Crusaders sparked a deeper curiosity in him. Over the next 3 years, He spent many months in northern Syria at an archaeological site called Karamish, and his time there was likely the happiest period of his life, when he developed a deep affection for the land and its people. It was at Karamish that his intensely romantic vision of desert Arabs and his personal connection with them first took shape. To him, the Bedouin of the desert, born and raised within it, had embraced with all his soul a harsh nakedness that was too severe for volunteers, living among air and winds, sun and light, open spaces, and vast emptiness. In many ways, he invented his identity as he progressed, drawing from his own soul, his fascination with medievalism, archaeology, origins, roots, and romantic peoples meant to be liberated. War would eventually harden Lawrence's idealized vision of the desert and its people into a more strategic outlook, as he regarded them as perhaps the most elusive enemy an army ever faced, inhabiting one of the most difficult regions in the world for civilized warfare. By early 1917, while based in the desert with Faisal's warriors, Lawrence began to see a larger role for the Arab Revolt and set out to prove it. The strategically located port city of Aqaba lay midway between the Sinai Desert and the vital Hijaz Railroad, and Ottoman Turkish troops stationed there dominated both. Their huge cannons were permanently locked in position facing the Red Sea, the only possible route of attack, while behind the city stretched a desert so harsh that it was left unguarded. Lawrence and Faisal agreed to attempt the impossible, to attack Aqaba from the desert. So he decided to go his own way, with or without orders, writing a letter full of apologies explaining that his intentions were of the best, and then he went. Not only did Lawrence ignore the orders under which he was in Arabia, it appears that he mounted the expedition to Aqaba entirely of his own volition, and his superiors in Egypt had no idea where he was. With close to 50 tribal warriors, Lawrence left Faisal's camp and disappeared into the desert. Crossing desolate and forbidding landscapes and visiting one remote oasis after another, they slowly cobbled together an army, holding it together with gold and promises of loot and freedom from the Turks. After 8 weeks, 2,000 Arabs suddenly swept into Aqaba in a surprise attack, and Aqaba was theirs. Aqaba was a very significant victory not only for the Arabs but for the British as well, because once Lawrence took Aqaba, the Arab Revolt was suddenly on the Turks' doorstep. The new general, Edmund Allenby, instantly understood what the startling victory at Aqaba meant. The Arabs could play a role in winning the larger war. Allenby therefore gave Lawrence weapons, gold, and the freedom to fight in his own unconventional way. Together with Faisal's men, Lawrence launched a series of harassing raids that damaged, though did not destroy, the Hijaz and Trans-Jordan railroads, the only source of supplies and reinforcements for the Turkish Ottoman troops. He described the campaign as splendid, saying one could not imagine greater fun for them or greater vexation and fury for the Turks. A note from his immediate superior in Egypt to another office in Cairo even remarked that a train had been blown up in southern Syria a few days earlier and that they could probably assume Captain Lawrence was actually still there. What Lawrence did was create a theory of warfare about how to succeed without fighting conventional battles. He argued that if you could keep hundreds of thousands of men on garrison duty standing guard against you because they did not know where you would strike next, that was a very effective form of warfare. His writings on guerrilla warfare would later inspire generations of fighters, from the North Vietnamese to U.S. Army Special Operations. He was the first to articulate a doctrine of guerrilla warfare in a rational manner, and it is no coincidence that from the time he did so in late 1916 and early 1917, the guerrilla war against the Turks in Arabia became far more effective and potent. Within months, 17 train engines, miles of track, and several strategic villages fell to the British and Arab raiders. The longer Lawrence fought beside the Arabs, the more he began to make their cause his own. After the capture of Aqaba, conditions in the field changed so much that he felt he was no longer merely a witness of the revolt but a protagonist in it. He had gone to Arabia as a liaison officer, whose only task was to liaise with the Arab Revolt, but once he found himself in a position to act, he became, for all intents and purposes, an Arab independence activist. Lawrence and dozens of other British officials were attempting to establish a form of indirect rule in which there would be an Arab government of sorts under British protection and control, yet still autonomous or semi-independent. However, there is every evidence that they did not truly want full Arab independence. As he himself admitted, his ambition was that the Arabs should become Britain's first brown dominion and not its last brown colony. Though he represented Great Britain, the most powerful colonial empire on earth, his new goal of Arab freedom was about to collide with the intentions of his own government. After promising freedom to the Arabs, Britain secretly made a deal with its ally France to divide the Middle East between them after the war. This agreement, known as the Sykes-Picot Accord, left no room for Arab independence. Lawrence thus found himself acting as the lead recruiter of the Arab tribes for the revolt while daily making promises about Arab independence that he suspected would not be honored. The sense that he was lying to the very people he was urging to sacrifice on Britain's behalf weighed heavily on him, and he confessed that they were being called to fight on a lie and that he could not stand it. His private shame became a public scandal when the lie was suddenly exposed. In November 1917, newspapers around the world published the Sykes-Picot Accord after Leon Trotsky, the Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the new Bolshevik regime in Russia, released the secret treaties that the Tsar diplomats had entered into, including the Sykes-Picot Accords. British diplomats then had to scramble across the Arab world to explain the inexplicable and justify the unjustifiable. That same month, another controversial British document appeared in the newsstands. The Balfour Declaration guaranteed Britain's support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, territory that had already been promised to both the Arabs and France. To some extent, British leaders felt their national survival was at risk and were willing to make any agreement necessary to survive as a nation, believing that the details and difficulties could be resolved once the war in Europe was over. British policy in the Middle East, however, lacked a central controlling authority and functioned like a ship without a rudder. Lawrence's Bedouin allies asked him which British pledge they should believe. Disgusted with himself, he reassured them of Britain's good intentions. The Hashemites continued to cooperate with the British largely because they had no choice, having invested so much in their alliance, though it is doubtful they ever truly trusted them, and they had even more reason for distrust after the publication of Sykes. In revenge, Lawrence vowed to make the Arab Revolt the engine of its own success and to lead it madly toward final victory. Yet victory still looked distant in 1917. On the Western Front, British troops fell back under withering German assaults, while in the Middle East the summer heat gave way to a freezing winter and defeat followed defeat. Surrounded by brutality and death, Lawrence grew increasingly sickened by his own role in the violence, admitting that he might not last much longer, that his nerves were failing and his temper wearing thin, and that he hoped to wake up alive again once the nightmare ended. The continual killing of Turks horrified him, and he came close to resigning and even thought of suicide. Less than a month after the Sykes-Picot headlines, however, the Middle East, long seen as a sideshow in the greater war effort, unexpectedly moved to center stage. In one pitched battle after another, General Allenby closed in on Jerusalem, a city under Ottoman rule since the 1500s, and he invited Lawrence to join the victory march. By 1917, the British public had been asked to make unprecedented sacrifices to sustain the war effort in France, and they needed a meaningful symbol of those sacrifices. The capture of the Holy Land, with its strong appeal to Victorian religious ideals, provided exactly that. General Allenby's triumphant entry into Jerusalem just before Christmas restored Britain's fading spirit and shifted the tide in the Middle East, as the Turks went on the run. Lawrence exchanged his Arab robes for a uniform and joined the procession, where he encountered Lel Thomas, an ambitious young American journalist seeking a colorful story for audiences back home. Lawrence fit that role perfectly, and the few days Thomas spent filming him later became a multimedia show that made them both world famous. Thomas photographed Lawrence at a crucial moment when, with the Turks finally in retreat, he began to see a path to fulfilling the promise he had made to the Arabs and to himself, the taking of Damascus. One of the world's oldest cities, perhaps dating back 6,000 years, Damascus was the political heart of the Arab world and in 1917 remained in Ottoman hands. According to Sykes-Picot, it was to be handed to France after the war, but if Faisal reached Damascus first and staked his claim, his victory might force France to back down. Lawrence urged Faisal forward, and the race for Damascus began. There was a grand desire to accomplish great deeds, making it natural for him to imagine taking Damascus and placing such visionary goals before his allies. The significance of his desert mission lay not in changing minds or persuading people to become Arab nationalists, but in convincing them that the moment had arrived and that their goal was attainable. He spoke of intending to make a new nation, restore a lost influence, and give 20 millions of Semites the foundation upon which to build an inspired dream palace of their national thoughts, an expression some described as eloquent megalomania. Critics argued that it was a conceit of agents of a great imperial power like Lawrence to believe they created nations, when in reality nations create themselves. His actions were driven by a passion for personal destiny and an obsession with doing something of importance, leading him to choose that particular nation and attempt to shape its future, raising the question of how far one can play with other people's lives and destinies to fulfill one's own ambitions. In the end, however, Faisal's troops did not liberate Damascus, because no one did. The Turks had already withdrawn days before Allenby's and Faisal's forces entered the city, making the moment neither the grand climax nor the clear victory Lawrence had envisioned. Amid the chaos of newly liberated Damascus, General Allenby met Faisal for the first time, and with Lawrence translating, he informed Faisal that until peace talks began he could administer Damascus and Syria, but only under French control, a result that was far from what either Faisal or Lawrence had been fighting for. That was not what Faisal or Lawrence had been fighting for, and they parted with heavy hearts. When Faisal had gone, I made to Allenby the last, and also I think the first request I ever made him for myself, leave to go away. In the end, he agreed, and then at once I knew how much I was sorry. After almost 2 years of desert combat, Lawrence's greatest battles were about to begin. November 1918 marked the end of the First World War, with Britain and France defeating Germany and the Ottoman Empire. In Damascus, Faisal defiantly began to set up an independent Syrian government. Yet the future of the Middle East was being decided far away in Paris, where the winners and losers of the Great War were gathering. Lawrence sent word for Faisal to join him in France. This was someone for whom Lawrence felt a certain amount of sympathy and towards whom he felt a great deal of guilt. That is clear. He and others felt that he let Faisal down in some measure, and Faisal was let down not just by Lawrence but by the British. With his flamboyant Arab headdress, Lawrence made himself the star of the peace conference. Winston Churchill called him one of nature's greatest princes. Together, Faisal and Lawrence stood before the Council of World Leaders and made an impassioned plea for Arab independence. Faisal was up against an absolutely brutal French policy which intended to prevent an independent Arab state in Syria or anywhere else for that matter. He needed the support of the British, but the Sykes-Picot Accord prevailed. France won Syria and Lebanon, while Britain took Palestine and Iraq. For war-ravaged Britain, controlling Iraq and its oil was more important than keeping a promise to the Arabs. Lawrence was suddenly confronted, for the first time, with the absolute failure of his will. Up till then, beyond his own agonies of duplicity, he had been able to pretty much obtain what he wanted in the field and make things happen. Now he found himself having lost this magic power he had. That is how it must have been experienced. He was back in his suit, a little fellow at the conference, and nothing he did helped. Nothing. Just days after the peace conference ended, L.O.L. Thomas and his traveling extravaganza set up shop in London's Royal Opera House, making Lawrence a star. During the next several months, over 1 million people would see the show in London alone. Lawrence was both alarmed by his new fame and drawn to it. He had fought an unconventional war, and his diplomacy would be just as unconventional. He collaborated with L.O.L. Thomas in London, posed for further photos, and the articles that L.O.L. Thomas wrote were indirectly dictated by Lawrence to suit the battle he was fighting for the Arab political cause. Lawrence was probably one of the first 20th-century figures to understand how the media could be used to further a public career and to further advocacy of public causes. The cause would soon grow urgent. Faisal returned to Damascus and was elected king of Syria, the first independent Arab state, but it lasted only 4 months. 90,000 French troops marched in, crushed his government, occupied Damascus, and sent him into exile with Britain's blessing. With Faisal suddenly stateless, Lawrence began a frantic letter-writing campaign that would unexpectedly pay off. His sending of anonymous letters to newspapers to try and influence policy was a sign of the desperation he felt in his advocacy of Arab independence, which had become his mission in life by that point. Struggling to somehow make his government keep its promises to the Arabs, Lawrence came close to collapse. But so did Iraq, where 10,000 Iraqis and 450 British soldiers died fighting in the first months of occupation. Lawrence went on the attack, writing that the people of England had been led into a trap that would be hard to escape with dignity and honor, tricked by a steady withholding of information. He wrote about Iraq in the British papers, scathingly critical of the British administration there and of the British army in Iraq. He argued that their government was worse than the old Turkish system and asked how long they would permit thousands of imperial troops and tens of thousands of Arabs to be sacrificed on behalf of a colonial administration which could benefit nobody but its administrators. Lawrence's guerrilla diplomacy proved successful. Winston Churchill, newly appointed colonial secretary, implored Lawrence to help resolve the crisis in Iraq. At the Cairo Conference of 1921, Faisal's brother Abdullah was offered the newly created Kingdom of Jordan, which his descendants still rule today. Faisal himself was placed on the throne of Iraq, where his family remained in power until the late 1950s. At the time, it seemed a tidy solution, but the long-term consequences were enormous. Many of the crises in the Middle East today can trace their origins to the British efforts during the First World War, the subsequent British and French mandates, and the outcomes of the Cairo Conference. When we examine the roots of the Middle East's modern turmoil, we must recognize Lawrence, Churchill, and figures like them as central actors. Lawrence never fully grasped the long-term effects of his nation-building efforts, though their immediate impact filled him with both pride and shame. He regarded the Cairo settlement as the crowning achievement of his life, yet simultaneously judged his actions in Arabia as morally indefensible. Retreating from public life, he returned to his alma mater, Oxford, to complete his account of the Arab Revolt. He titled it 7 Pillars of Wisdom, aspiring for it to stand alongside epic novels like Moby Dick and the Brothers Karamazov. In reality, it became a singular classic. 7 Pillars of Wisdom functions as a memoir, a military campaign history, and a travelogue all at once. Lawrence wrote of living for years in the naked desert under an indifferent sky. By day, the scorching sun exhausted them and the relentless wind left them dizzy. By night, dew soaked them, and the countless silent stars imposed a humbling sense of insignificance. They were devoted to freedom, a purpose so consuming it drained all their strength, a hope so transcendent it eclipsed their earlier ambitions. Readers sense the majesty of his prose and are captivated by it. The book is undeniably splendid. Lawrence hoped his work would correct the record and ease his troubled conscience, but it accomplished neither. While beautifully written, it was not intended to be a factual account. Many details cannot be verified in Hashemite, Ottoman, or British records. Despite being widely treated as a straightforward memoir, evidence suggests Lawrence conceived it more as a historical novel. Debates over the accuracy of its details and the true significance of Lawrence's role in the Arab Revolt continue today. I am somewhat biased regarding Lawrence's honesty. Those I interviewed who witnessed parts of his life found him largely truthful, as what he said could often be corroborated. On the other hand, he had a tendency toward dramatic self-exaggeration. Lawrence attempted to shape history, yet history resisted him. He tried to record it, yet felt he had failed. Ultimately, he sought to escape history itself. Hounded by the press, he changed his name first to Ross, then to Shaw, disappearing into the Royal Air Force. As Private Shaw, he served quietly for nearly 13 years. He retired in February 1935, writing on May 12, "At present, I'm sitting in my cottage and getting used to an empty life." The next morning, while riding his motorcycle along country lanes, he swerved to avoid 2 boys on bicycles and crashed. He never regained consciousness. Lawrence died on May 19, 1935, at the age of 46. Winston Churchill attended the funeral with family and friends, later remarking, "His pride and many of his virtues were superhuman. He could only fly in a hurricane. I fear, whatever our need, we shall never see his like again." When considering the sources that shape Western perceptions of the Arab world, 7 Pillars of Wisdom stands among the most influential. It is a masterwork, one that can be read and reread endlessly. Yet it also propagated the misconception that Arabs are inseparable from the desert, an idea that is both simplistic and misleading. Some great men are driven to achieve so ardently that they invent parts of their own legend, but that same drive can lead them to accomplish extraordinary deeds. Lawrence exemplifies this. He did indeed perform remarkable acts. Some of the most thoughtful critiques of Lawrence are not accusations of hypocrisy, but charges that he attempted to appropriate history, and, by extension, other lives, for his own destiny. This can be seen as ultimate historical arrogance. Each reader must judge whether such criticism undermines all he accomplished. As the saying goes, "Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their minds wake in the day to find all was vanity." But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dreams with open eyes and make them real. Lawrence was undoubtedly such a man.